going to talk a little bit, let him level it out. So as he said, I'm from Eugene, Oregon, a land far away up in the Northwest. And it's interesting. One of the biggest things that's different is we thought we were kind of the capital of rain. Because over there, it just kind of like drizzle, 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 drizzle. All the time, all the time. You go months, and it's just drizzle, drizzle, drizzle. Then we come here, and we see people with umbrellas. We kind of chuckle. We're like, oh, they got their umbrellas. Aren't they cute? And then it rained for real. Now, this is like drizzle, drizzle. It was like, boom, it was happening. And we were like, oh, umbrellas, that's why you would have those things. So that was one of our first little mini culture shock things there. I'm excited to be over here. I'm excited to be in Restoration Church. I'm excited to be working along these wonderful people here. It's nice to be called out of something. I know it sounds a little weird to be called out of something, but where I'm from, people are very stoic. We approach the Word of God from an intellectual perspective, right? I've fallen asleep in church, y'all. I'm sorry. I admit it. It's happened because of the way that it is being presented. And we don't get that here. You can't fall asleep with Jasper and Nate's talking over there. It's not going to happen. So I'm excited to come out of that. That being said, maybe I bring a little bit of an intellectual approach to stuff. Sometimes my sermons start out nice. We go a little deep. We talk about some stuff that's going to make you want to wiggle in your seat, get a little uncomfortable. But the good news is that we serve a good God. We come out of that because there's hope. Sometimes we got to talk about the hard stuff, right? We got to talk about that stuff because there's a solution to it. And that's the difference we got between us and the world. The world talks about bad stuff. They watch the news. They get depressed. And that's it. That's the end of the conversation. They just go on being that way. They go on being depressed. But we got a life and a hope that comes from Christ. And that's the good news. So one of the jobs I had before I moved out here, I worked in the Oregon Mental Hospital, and I worked with people with mental issues. I did that in that field for about 10 years. And it was really interesting coming at this institution that's dealing with problems from a very worldly perspective and being someone who's spiritually minded. So there's a funny story I like to share with people where sometimes it breaks out a little bit. Where they had this lady, I don't know, it may be a weird reference, but have you ever seen The Simpsons? And they have the crazy cat lady. And she goes, she's got big, long, gray, stringy hair. That lady's real. That's a real person. I've seen her. She was in the hospital. And they couldn't get her to take her pills. They couldn't get her to take her meds. They were having a hard time with her. They were worried she was going to get aggressive. And they said, send us anybody. Send us anybody. We need someone else. We need a new face and a new perspective to come in and help me with this situation. So I was like, I'll do it. And I wander in there, and she's in the middle of it. She sees me walk in, she stops, she goes, Archangel Michael. And I was like, that's right. You should take your medicine there. And she just did it, snapped it all up, and went on with her day. And they were like, thank you so much. And I was like, the only thing I did is show up. But it was the spirit inside of me, the Jesus that was there, that invaded the physical from the spiritual. Because I'm trying, and that's my goal of life, y'all, is to be like Jesus. And it's not even my main point, it's the one minor point, but like when you are something, you don't have to try to be that thing, right? You don't see an apple tree, and you probably heard this one before, but I'm gonna do it again. You don't see an apple tree like, time to make an apple, and it like makes an apple, like, ooh, that was hard. No, an apple tree is just being a tree. It's going about its day, and all of a sudden, like, what's that? Oh, that's an apple, you can have it if you want. It's just naturally what it does. So that's just for free right there before we get into the other stuff I'm talking about. So when I'm thinking about Jesus and we're thinking about how do we be like Jesus, I mean, obviously, if we get so filled with the Holy Spirit, it just manifests wonderful. But there's key moments I'm going to talk about that happen in Jesus' life where he was God, but he was also a person, and he had to make the active choice to be who he was in spite of his circumstances and situation. So let's look at Jesus. He had characters and unique qualities that made him a human. I mean, though he was God, he was still a man. He loved to eat. So one of my favorite things about Jesus is he does his entire work. He goes to the cross, he goes to hell, he gets the keys to death and hell, comes back to earth, and the first thing the guy does is like, let's get some fish, I'm hungry. That's what he does when he meets with the disciples. Like he sees them, they see him from the boat, and he's like, I'm making breakfast. Like the guy liked to eat. That's one of those like unique things about him that just, is this being weird? Yeah. And they're trying to find him, and when they find him, what's he doing? He's going there and he's arguing with people and he's having a debate. Like even from a young child, like the guy liked that. That's something in his like character that he enjoyed doing. Oh, there we go. He liked children. There's that verse in there where the disciples are trying to keep the children away. And Jesus is like, no, let the children come. Like he appreciated them. He liked their vulnerability, their openness. He appreciated those things about him. That makes him a person and not just this figure. Because I think sometimes we see that figure. We think of like Jesus on the cross, and we think of this like perfect, holy, together, like inhuman, almost robotic version of what it needs to be super spiritual. And like, no, he was 100% God and 100% person at the same time. Which is hard sometimes because in school we don't learn things that are 100%, so you can't do that. No. God doesn't play by the rules. He breaks those rules. He was both at the same time. So let's go through, so we talked about what Jesus likes. Let's go through a little bit Jesus' emotions and feelings, because I think that's kind of what I wanted to really hit on today, is talking about our feelings and emotions and how they interplay with our spirituality. Jesus was compassion. He loved compassion. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd in Matthew. He felt for them. He didn't analytically see a problem and go to approach it. I mean, I'm sure there's part of that, but he felt for them. He was happy. They were talking about when he sent out the disciples to go and minister the word. It said at the same time, Jesus was filled with the joy of the Holy Spirit when they returned. When he saw a good work, he was filled with joy. Anger. Remember him cleansing the temple? He's flipping over tables. He's whipping people. One of my favorite silly little things is like there's this pictures of, they have this old school picture of like Jesus with his whip in his hand, and he said, when they say what would Jesus do, remind them that flipping over tables and whipping people is still in the picture. I just thought that was a little funny because we don't think of Jesus. We think of him that way. We don't think of him as being angry. Anger's bad, right? We don't do angry. Anger's bad. God does angry. Can we? Are we allowed? I think with the right thing, maybe. We'll get to that, though. Sadness. Here's a wild quote about Jesus when you think about, like, the pious and put-together Jesus. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with the deepest grief. Ooh. That doesn't sound too, like, soft and friendly. Like, if I came to you and I said, I am a man who is despised and rejected, of deep sorrows, acquainted with the deepest grief, you'd probably think there might be something wrong with me. But Jesus was that way, and there was nothing wrong with him. So he was 100% real, having full real feelings, likes, interests, irritations. So why then does sometimes the church only appreciate some of these? Compassion. Oh, yes, of course, compassion. Happiness. Yes, happiness. Anger. Ooh, I don't know. It's not very spiritual to be angry, right? We're not allowed to do that. Can we do that? Sadness. Like if I came in on one Sunday and I was like sad, dealing with deep grief and regret, y'all would pray for me and love on me. And if I came back the next time and the next time, you'd kind of be like, maybe there's something wrong with him. Sometimes it's like that. I had a cousin who lost a baby. She was depressed for like a year. It was a long process. Sometimes the way out of that stuff is a long process. And you just praying and saying, hey, God, I'm having this problem. God is here with you. He's present. He's real, and he loves you. But sometimes that deliverance does not come in a second. Sometimes you've got to sit in that a little bit longer than you would prefer. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong in that situation. Sometimes you're going to be sad. Sometimes you're going to have those moments where you feel anxiety rise up in you. It's funny, I didn't even know what that feeling was till I was a couple years married and had kids, and I was like, I got this weird feeling, honey, where I feel like I kind of can't breathe, and she's like, that's called anxiety. And I was like, oh. And I've had that crop up in my life. I've had that crop up in my life doing exactly what God told me to do. God told me to do the thing, I showed up to do the thing, and I felt that way. Like the feeling gripped me, and I had it, and here's what happened. I felt guilty. I thought that maybe my faith wasn't strong enough. Maybe I'm not reading my Bible enough. Maybe since I'm having this feeling, there's something spiritually wrong. And the core of my message today is that is false. That is a lie from the pit of hell right there. Jesus was affected by things. You're going to be affected by things. The external world will interact with you on the spiritual level. You're going to tell me how spiritual you're going to be while you can't breathe? Not very spiritual. The physical interacts with you in that way. So when you're thinking about those times where you're having that weight, and you're having those big feelings, and you're feeling like maybe it's not enough, I come back to the fact that my God is a God of hills and valleys. Both same. God's not just God when you're on top. God's still God when you're on the bottom. God's still God when you fail. I tried to do something recently, and I fell flat on my face, and I failed, and God was still there, and I was still in his will. God is all-powerful in light and in darkness. Talk about him being light, and he is the light, and that is 100% true. But just because there's no light in an area, specifically maybe an area in somebody's life, it doesn't mean that God isn't there. God is the God of light and the darkness, both. He is so big, he is so powerful, he is so above that stuff that he is not limited in that way like we are. God is with me in my happiness and my sorrow. And I say in my sorrow, not instead of my sorrow, while I am in sorrow. While I am in sorrow so deep that I feel my faith shake. Oh, wait a minute. He's a pastor. He can't talk about having doubt or having a moment like that. That's not spiritual. You can't do that. Hold up. Let's check out on in on Jesus. What do we do here? So we have that feeling. We have that moment where you're having that big feeling, or you're having doubt. I'm going to say it like that because it's a secret. We can't talk about it too loud. Otherwise, the good church people will hear me talk about doubt. They'll take away my license. I'll be done. So I'm going to trust you guys with this thing. So do with our doubt. So let's take a look at the Garden of Gethsemane. This is one of my favorites. So Jesus is going to the garden. This is before the crucifixion and all of that good stuff that Jesus does. That hard stuff, I should say. He goes to he goes away, which is one of my favorite things about Jesus, is he liked his time apart from doing stuff, apart from the ministry. And I can relate to that. I'm going to come up here, I'm going to talk about the word, I'm going to preach, I'm going to do that, and afterwards, I'm going to go to my room by myself and have a moment. Sometimes I'll go out to the hills, I'll go for a hike, oh my gosh, going in nature, I love doing that. So when I read about that thing about Jesus, I relate to that. So this is his moment before he does a great work. He brings the disciples with him. This is what he says. My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. So he's God. He's human, but he's God, and his soul is crushed with grief. So what does he do? He asks for support from the fellow believers. He goes to the disciples. He says, come and pray with me, and he went to God. So that's what you do. That's the way out. When you have the heavy feeling, when you have the anxiety, when you have the sadness, the depression, those things, those polite things that you don't talk about in polite church, when those things come, and they will, we seek help from fellow believers, and we go to God with it. It's our response that makes a difference, and not the fact that it happens. Because as I said, I felt that. I felt bad for feeling that way. Like, how can I be like, man, I've seen people healed. I've been healed. I grew up in the church. Like, I've gone to foreign countries to spread the gospel. Like, I've maybe seen angels. I don't know. I know God. One of my very first memories, I was 5 years old, and some crazy church filled me up with the Holy Spirit, and I was talking in tongues. So I know it on a primal level. And yet, in that moment, I wasn't feeling it. I wasn't feeling victorious, and I wasn't feeling, and I felt bad, and I felt shame, and I felt like there's something wrong. Spiritually, I can't do this. Go to God. Go to your people. You got to have your people. Your safe people. This is what I call them, my safe people. Were like someone like I could go to and I could talk to. One of my favorites was in Oregon. I had this guy. He was a pastor and also a garbage man that worked the night shift. And I stay up late. It's one of the things I do. So sometimes we would go up and we'd meet up at midnight in like back alleyways next to the garbage cans. And we'd like talk about the gospel and all the different things. And I could say whatever I wanted. There was a freedom there I had with working with a fellow believer that when I could say something out loud and be honest with where I was at, we could have a real conversation. Like if I'm having doubt, our tendency is to be like, no, I know too much. It was the Bible and I grew up in the church and I'm good. I'm like, No, if you're having doubt, say you're having doubt. Have that conversation. Have that conversation with your safe people. Have that conversation with God. So the question I have is, where's your garden? Because there's going to be a place in your life where you're not feeling victory. And we like to pretend it ain't there. We like to pretend like everything's good, we're super spiritual, and we're blessed above all else. And we kind of like ignore that one area. And that's what's wild about that I'm finding about this walk with God, is you can be 100% in so many areas, and you always find that one spot where you're kind of like, ooh. So that happened to me recently. We moved out here because God told us to move out. And things didn't go the way that I had projected in my head. They didn't go the way I thought they would go. Like, things didn't work out the way I thought they would work out. And it hit me hard. And like, I for the longest time, I was like, no, it's fine. God has to do it. We're fine. And the skies turned to brass. God stopped talking. God didn't talk to me for a month, y'all. I prayed. I listened to worship music. I did everything. God did nothing. And I cried out, and I'm like, why? Why aren't you saying anything? It's like that moment Jesus had where he's like, God, why have you forsaken me? Once again, that's something Jesus said. So if you're feeling that, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. And this came from me being in that spot and then finally being like, I'm upset. I'm going to say it out loud. I don't know what's going on. I'm having big feelings right now. I don't want to say it, but it's true. I'm doubting what's going on. Like, I'm having a moment of doubt. And it wasn't until I had that conversation with God, that I said those words out loud, that we actually grew past that. And I'm thinking, I don't know for sure, but I'm thinking maybe that quiet period was to get me to the point where I was ready to be honest. Because how are you going to do that in your relationships? There's so many relationships that fall apart because when you're spending time with someone and you're like trying to get to know them, you're doing your relationship stuff, and then something rubs you the wrong way, but you don't talk about it. And something else, and you don't talk about it, and something else, you don't talk about it, and one day out of the blue, you're like, I don't want to see you ever again, this is over, boom, and you're out the door, and they're like, that person was mentally unstable, is what that person was, right? You're going to lose relationships over that. You got to talk about that stuff, even if it's uncomfortable. Me and the wife did that. First year we were married was like Vietnam. It was, oh my gosh, so many like, I feel like you're, and we hashed all that stuff out. But then the wonderful part is like now there's nothing to hash out like that. Like we already did that. We had the hard conversations. Like we had those like headbutt moments where we like both didn't want to move, and you went through that. So we're like Jesus, or are we like Jesus when things are going well, but what about when we're in it? Can we be like Jesus? Can we be like Jesus, choosing to be who we're supposed to be? And we're dealing with that estranged relative. You feeling the Spirit then? Maybe not. What about when confronting or interacting with an abuser? Ooh. I had a cousin. Cousin had some stuff happen with a relative. 20 years after that event, she saw the person's name written down and like had a panic attack because there was no freedom in that person's life from that situation because she didn't lean into God. She didn't have that uncomfortable feeling and go to God with it and explore it and deal with it and have like go through that process that happens when you're dealing with someone who's done you wrong, especially on that level. That's a big deal, and you've got to do that because if you don't, it's going to get you. It's going to cripple you. These moments, these garden moments will take a toll on us. We will be affected, but that doesn't mean we aren't like Jesus, but it's our response that matters. Big feelings are normal, even the less popular ones. Jesus was affected by the world around him, his feelings, likes, and dislikes. You are allowed to feel things too. That's my big message today. Do you got a relative who like recently died? Be sad for as long as that takes. Okay? That's a real feeling. That's an okay feeling. It doesn't mean you're not spiritual when you grieve the loss of somebody. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. You can be at the center of God's will, doing exactly what you're supposed to do, and still feel sorrow, fear, and anxiety, possibly doubt. Don't say that one. Because Jesus dealt with those things. Did I miss it? I think I missed it. Yeah, I missed it. So it's talking about doubt. Here's a little uncomfortable one. Jesus is in the garden. He's praying, "My Father, is it possible to let this cup of suffering be taken away from me? Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." He did this 3 times. So God, talking to God, said this thing and didn't get enough of a response that he had to do it again. And then he didn't get enough of a response that he had to do it again. So once again, if you're not hearing from God, sometimes maybe you're like me and you got a hard head. Sometimes that's just how those things happen. God gave him a direction and he struggled with it. When God gives you direction, sometimes you might struggle with it. Just because it's from God doesn't mean it's going to be easy or happy. Like sometimes you're going to have the conflict that comes from doing God's will. That's a regular thing. Jesus did that. We're going to have to do that. But the good news is we have a place to go with our feelings. 1 Peter says, "Cast your anxiety on him, for he cares about you." And this tells us 2 things. 1, you're going to have anxiety. How are you going to cast something you don't have? And 2, you have somewhere to go with these feelings. Just as Jesus did in the garden, he felt it, got support from fellow believers, and went to God with his anxiety. As I kind of touched on a little while ago, it might take a while. Sometimes that season lasts longer than we would like it to. I'm still in that season. That season I talked about where I had like anxiety and like mild depression and like was struggling with dealing with that. I'm not out of that. Do you want me to be real? I don't feel like I should be here. I don't feel like I'm qualified to deliver the message like these 2 gentlemen are here. Where I'm at emotionally is I want to pass this mic over to these guys and let them do it because I don't think I can do a good job at it. I don't think I'm in a spot to do that. But, it's like it says in Philippians, one thing I do is I press on. Looking at not myself, not relying on my works, but relying on my faith. And so in my faith, I say, God has something that he wants said today. And he chose to use me to do it. And even if I don't feel like that's a good call on his part, I bow to his wisdom and I do what I'm told because I'm a good soldier. Because that's the one thing I can control. Sometimes we can't control our feelings. They just rise up. When I was struggling with anxiety the other day, it was weird. One day, I was like in a good mood, but I was still anxious. I was like, I feel like I can't breathe, but everything's fine. But I feel like sometimes you can't do anything about that. But what you can do is choose your response. And I know it sounds like I'm talking in circles, but I'm doing the Bible thing where I keep on talking about the same thing again and again because I feel like that's the thing we want hammered through is we choose our response. When we have the big feelings, we choose how we respond to them. We connect with our believers, go to God. Because victory is inevitable, okay? So after that hard time, Jesus would happen. What happened after that? Well, it got worse, right? But then, it was the single most impactful thing that's happened in human history, right? Came back out of the grave with the keys to death and hell. He sent humankind on a new trajectory. Our dates on our calendars reflect this thing, this Jesus thing. And that came after a season of him being so grieved to the point he didn't know if he was going to make it through the day. This victory came after God didn't talk to him. This victory came after he prayed and didn't get a response. Because sometimes God takes us in the deep parts so he can bring us back out of it. And there's a reason for that. There's the multiple reasons. That's the thing with God. There's like multiple reasons, like a spider web of rationale and things that make sense that we can't really comprehend. But one of those reasons is testimony. That I can stand up here and I can say, like, I got some scars that I can tell you a story about. That God's taken me through some stuff. And ultimately, it's these things that make us stronger. Because it says in Revelation, when they're talking about how they're going to defeat the enemy, they're going to use 2 gods. They're going to use the word of God and the power of our testimony. Why are those in the same category? Right? Because the power of our testimony, it has a strength to it. The firmness that comes in belief from going through a situation and coming out the other side of it. I thank God that one of my spiritual blessings is the ability to take a punch. I don't know if it's a chicken or the egg. I don't know if that's why I have these situations happen to me, or he's like, I see where your life's going. I'm going to gift you this ability to get knocked down, stand up, and go, oh, I didn't like that, but I'm going to keep going forward. And so I guess in wrapping it up, feel it all. Don't be emotionally constipated. Sorry, that's a little it's a little mental health term we kind of toss around a little bit. Just try to hold the feelings up. Don't feel shame or guilt about your feelings. Be like Jesus. If you're sad, be sad. If you're happy, you're happy. If you're anxious, have those feelings, take it to God, and go through the process. This is the fight we're fighting. So we're going to wrap up and do a little altar call moment here, I'm thinking, because I really want to provide a space for anybody to be honest about their situation. If there's something I'm talking about where you realize in your life, do you have an area, a stronghold, something where you have fear? You're afraid that God's not going to show up the way that he said he would, and you don't talk about it because it's not very Christian, but it's still there. If that's a real thing, you got to take it to God. Do you have doubt? Do you see the good things that God's promised you in the distance and doubt that you're ever actually going to get there? Are you going to be real with that? Because I had to go through that process. I had to get real with it. I had to say, yeah, doubt God. I had a moment where I doubted that you had my back. And it hurts me. It hurts me to say that, but that's real. That's where I was at. And I needed to take that to him and be honest with it so that we can have a real relationship, so that we can have a real conversation. So if that's you, and you feel your pulse quickening at this moment when I mention that, then maybe you got some business you need to attend to. So I'm going to pass off the mic to these professionals, let them head it up.